Okay, welcome everybody to the webinar entitled 5 Best Practices to Crush Training ROI. And I'm Scott Cassidy. I'll be your host today, but more importantly, I'm joined by President and CEO of Aslan Training and Development, Tom Stanfield. Tom, welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me today, Scott. Excited about this topic.
Great topic. And you know, so many people in so many large and small organizations around the world invest in sales training every day, and they do so and get value out of it sometimes. And so I think the idea here today is, and the purpose of the entire webinar, is to give people some of the best practices and maybe some of the pitfalls and stories of what might not go right, so that we can ensure an ROI when we make an investment of this size. And and so that's kind of where we want to get started. By way of introduction, Tom, you've been around this game for quite some time. I think 23 years with this company, Aslan Training and Development, but your background goes much further back. So why don't you tell us all a little bit about yourself and how long you've been at this in terms of training and development?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I was one of the founders of Aslan, and you know why I love this topic is because our focus, even though we're sales training and leadership development training firm, our focus is really how do we change the way people sell. And a lot of people get excited about training and they think training is a solution. And when you implement a training program, you're really about 50% there. The real work begins once training is over. As I remember seeing on the title of a book a long time ago, you can't teach someone to play golf in a seminar. So there's a lot of work that has to happen, and people can get frustrated or lose faith in training because the change doesn't happen in a workshop, right? You get excited, people get it pumped up, and then they go back to their role on Monday. A lot of times they're the exact same people. Yeah, there's definitely a lift, and people get excited, and people maybe change beliefs, but the real work begins. So what I love about this topic is what we've been doing for the last 20-something years in the hundreds of organizations we work with is we've been focused on who does it well. Yeah. We've got kind of this hall of fame of leaders, and whether they're in the learning leaders or they're sales leaders, of who's really done it well. And we started going through recently, here are all, looking at all the companies who've seen double-digit increases in revenue and whatever they're measuring, conversion rates and customer loyalty. And we actually saw that of the companies that do this well and follow the best practices that we're going to talk about today, they've seen an average increase of 44%. That's huge when you think about the lift.
And quickly as well, right?
Well, some of them have seen it in 6 months. Yeah. Some of them, had one organization we work with, Cox Business, they were a $700 million company. They had about 700 reps. They wanted to get to $2 billion in 3 years, and they implemented exactly what we're going to talk about today, and they were able to hit that number. So some lifts are millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and other organizations are small and they're seeing a huge increase in conversion. So we're going to talk about what do the best of the best do to drive change.
Well, let me chime in there too, because I haven't always worked at Aslan, as you know, and maybe some of the folks don't know this, but I was a client of Aslan, for many, many years at a company called Schneider Electric. And, we had about 150 reps we put through the program, and we saw a 30% increase in incremental revenue within 6 months. Yeah. And so I became a raging fan early on. I believe the sustainment piece of what we were able to establish, and we'll get into all the detail of that in this webinar, that was what made a difference. And we took a cost center and we turned it into a profit center with the help of Aslan. And that was really, really encouraging. So excited to have you. Let's talk about, maybe who we're actually designing this discussion for. There's sales leaders, there's learning and development, there's big companies, there's small companies. Like, who does this really apply to?
Well, our goal is to apply to everybody. So as we go through this, and as you mentioned, there's going to be a Q&A at the end. Right. So if we don't specifically answer some of your questions or how this may apply in your role, hopefully you'll ask the questions that you need to get the information that you desire. But we're really going to be talking to both learning and the learning leader and the sales leader. Yeah. I actually think the learning leader has more challenges. because they have to get an organization who they do not control. They have to motivate them to do things differently.
Yeah.
And so the sales leader might look to learning and say, hey, go fix this problem. And the learning leader looks at the sales leader and go, hey, look, I only own a percentage of what needs to happen to drive change. So I want to talk to both of them. And then there's the leader who maybe runs a team and wants to change their organization, but doesn't have the support of the senior leader. So we're going to be talking to everybody that cares about driving change.
Yeah, which can be, the larger the organization can involve many, many, many folks. And so let's talk again. We've got 5 key areas we're going to focus on, 5 best practices, if you will.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with the first one? And
that's a good place to start.
Because it's the most important one, we think, right? I mean, and basically, the slide we're showing, it says it starts at the top. What does that mean, Tom? Tell me what that means and why it's so important.
This is, I do think, the number one either barrier to change or the reason that change occurs is you have to start with senior leadership, right? Because the senior leadership is either going to derail transformation or they're going to drive transformation. They're going to have 2 roles. And I think of a couple of companies that we worked with several years ago where the senior leaders derailed transformation, because what happens is everybody gets on board, says, yeah, go train them. And then as soon as training happens, everybody's happy, the feedback's great. And then senior leaders can move on to the next initiative. Well, we're just beginning. We were in the process of, as we're going to talk about, certifying leaders and developing a measurement system and changing the roles of the reps. And all of a sudden, the senior leaders were not connected to what we were doing at the ground floor level, and then they created another initiative. And all of a sudden, everybody was focused on something else. Right. So whether what you're going to measure, the rep's role, for example. So the rep, we could be training the rep on how to serve the customer and focus on being what we call more other-centered and meeting the customer's needs and having a process built around what's important to customer. Well, then we get to the end of the quarter and the numbers aren't where they need to be, and all of a sudden leaders go throw that out and just go sell something now. And so that just undermines everything that we're doing. So whether what you're measuring, what the leadership needs to do from the standpoint of coaching, the messaging, the values, everything that's going to happen. Who's going to coach and when? How often do we coach? Do there need to be barriers removed from a frontline leader who has no time to coach because the senior leader is saddling them with other responsibility? Just all of those elements, we have to get them in a room.
That's right.
And they have to go, this is what's going to happen, and this is how they're going to drive it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the overwhelming number of companies listening to this, whether it's live today or on a recording later, are probably struggling with carving out enough time to do the coaching, right? And doing it. I was with a group not too long ago that said they literally are with their reps twice a year. Yeah. Well, so is that enough? I would venture to say it isn't, and they agreed, and they've got to change some things. So what do you stop doing in order to create that?
You've got to do that. And that's the number one. That's the second thing that what the senior leadership needs to determine. This is one of the first questions I ask when I meet with the senior leadership team and we're driving an initiative like we're talking about, right? Is what's the coaching cadence? And what do you want them to do? And they'll say, well, what needs to happen? Well, you at least need to be with your sellers once a month, at least. The goal really would be once a week. Right. But I know some coaches or frontline leaders may not be coaching at all. Or once I rode with a rep recently and I said, when's the last time your manager rode with you? And he said 19 years ago. Oh, now there's a lot of, So there's meetings, right? There's meetings that occur and people have conversations and discuss strategy, and there's accountability and but it's not coaching. Yeah. Right. So you need to be able to observe your reps and meet with them, because developing a new set of competency requires practice. It requires skill development. And as we're going to talk about, change happens one-to-one. So the senior leaders need to figure out, okay, if they're not coaching now, what needs to happen for the frontline leaders to free up the time to coach? Yeah. And then what do they need to measure? Well, what are they going to hold them accountable to? We define what coaching means in this context, because we don't want to leave we're not talking about the measuring the metrics, the revenue, and that. We're talking about something beyond that. Right. Yeah, so that's a great question. So coaching management is usually about history.
Yeah.
Right. What's happened, what's the numbers, where are we with the numbers, whether they're productivity numbers or results. It's like accountability, it's discussions related to that. Coaching is not a conversation. Coaching is watching people do their job, right, in their role, because I can't assess your abilities unless I watch you, right? I don't know how well someone plays the guitar unless I listen to them.
That's right.
They may be able to read music, but I don't know if they can play it. I got to watch them. If I want to assess a chef, an athlete, anybody that's heavy skilled involved in their role, like salespeople, you need to watch them, their abilities. And then there needs to be developmental activities or development process, which requires practice. So that's what coaching is about. It's figuring out what their level of capabilities are. It's observing them, because I can't do that without observing them. And then it's coming up with a development plan. So I can have a Monday morning meeting, but that's not coaching.
Yeah. I love the analogy I heard recently that, everything that happens on Sunday in the NFL is part of Sunday. Monday morning, when we get in the film room, that's when we turn our attention to improving and how we get better for next Sunday afternoon. And that's the coaching, right? So you can't change anything that happens Sunday.
Well, and I wasn't very good, but I played football in college, and I like to use this analogy because we had the leadership meeting where they got in front of us and they were excited and they got us all excited about winning, and that was a very short period of time. And then we had the management meeting on Sunday, which was we watched the game films and we got our feedback on our scores and how well we blocked or whatever our role was, and then we were coached Monday through Friday. And I think that's a great ratio. It should be majority of coaching, working on skill development, practicing, because most of what sellers do is skills.
Yeah. So let's move to the how. Like, how do we assess and sort of align a group around a specific set of capabilities, if you will?
Well, I don't want to miss the last bullet.
Sure.
Scott. So the one other thing that the leadership needs to determine is the why. The why behind, because I think that's so critical. Is when
it's a good point. Yeah.
When you're meeting with your senior leadership, we need to determine what's the purpose. So every training initiative is centered around changing something. Why do we want to change?
Right.
So here's the question. It's either about serving the customer or it's about making more money.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really it. Now that doesn't mean we don't want to make more money.
Right.
But it's either about serving the customer, making more money. People aren't motivated to make more money, just make more money. I mean, let me say it this way. Everybody knows that the training is going to be, it's going to help them make more money, but that's not what really drives engagement. Engagement is about mastery, meaning, and autonomy.
Yeah.
And so we want to give them meaning, and people are connected to purpose. And so if you can connect, hey, why are we doing this? Because we want to serve our customer better. We want to provide them better solutions. And we want to give you, again, meaning behind what you're doing. And when that becomes the central focus and the leaders are driving that, you draw in the majority of people who may not be motivated by dollars.
I gotcha. Yeah, no, and I think you and I have talked in the past. We have a podcast series called Ales with Aslan that many of you may have heard before. And we talk about that rep motivation, and what's intrinsically motivates them isn't always just the financial aspects of the company doing well and even them doing well. There's something behind that.
There's something. That's what gets the people.
They got to get to.
We all thirst for purpose.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a book that just came out. There's a quote on the screen, a book that I just read. It's called "It's the Manager," and it's a study by I think the CEO and another key leader at Gallup, and it comes from tens of millions of research that they've done. And they basically said it all falls down to everything that you want to accomplish in an organization really falls down to the frontline manager. It's all about the manager. It's the name of the book. It's the manager. And he says, if your employees don't know your organization's purpose, they will leave.
Yeah.
It should say, I think the quote is the best employee. So that's the message that needs to be sent from senior leadership. So now we can talk about how. Yeah.
So let's talk about the how. The where the pain is, what are we trying to solve? How do we kind of assess that?
So if you're, a leader that needs to sell to the senior leader, there's really a two-step process. And, I just went through this with a large organization where you had a West division and an East division, and then somebody that ran the whole organization, the chief revenue officer. So the first step is, and this always needs to be first, is the assessment.
Okay.
Right. So the assessment is you focus on both the reps and the frontline leaders, and the goal is to find out what's their desire to change, what are their challenges, and what's their competency level.
Yep.
And so you really want to have a feel for what's happening, what's happening on the front lines, because a lot of times the senior leaders don't really get that.
Well, yeah.
And so you want to go out there and get that information, and that's where you determine how much the coaches are coaching, right? And what really is the competency level. And when you put that together, the goal is you want them to feel the pain. You want to have the transcripts and the specific examples for what you witnessed in the field. Then you have an alignment meeting, because now we're going to get together. We've gone out in the field. We've got the data, and this doesn't take long. And if the listeners are interested in an article that we wrote that describes how to do this, we can certainly send that to them. But then you have an alignment meeting, which I would say it needs to be a minimum of 6 hours. I know that sounds a lot, but for them to really dive into what is happening in the field, and then understand what the learning objectives of what you're going to roll out and what their role is in sustainment and all the things that we're talking about, you need at least 6 hours. And we just did this with the organization, and you could see the shift from, oh my gosh, we didn't really understand what was happening in the field, and here's what we need to do. And there was a complete shift in change in our sustainment plan.
Yeah.
And you need that platform. You need the information, and you need the 6 hours minimum of time to be able to tell your story. And
I think, that's so critical. It's, like you said, it seems like a lot of time, but when you're making an investment like this, you want it to be sustained, and you've got to take the time up front to make sure you're evaluating and assessing things properly. It makes sense when you look at it in the context of this. I think
the problem is most people don't know how to ask for it. Either they don't know how to ask for it, or they ask for it and they don't allow the time, or they haven't done the assessment first.
Yeah.
But when you think about it and you position it as, look, you're the one that's going to determine whether this organization moves from 10 million to 20 million or 500 million to $1 billion.
Yeah.
You need to understand what we're doing. We need to align to the objectives, the role, what we're going to teach, and what you need to reinforce. Because if you don't role model this, and you don't support the messaging, and you don't drive change, it's not going to happen, and we are wasting our time. And you position it that way, people will buy in. Plus, they should want to know what's happening on the front lines.
Absolutely.
And I haven't struggled, if I've delivered that message, I haven't struggled to get the senior leaders involved.
Yeah.
And by the way, if they don't want to get involved,
it's a warning sign, isn't it?
Well, it could just be, hey, look, we're just going to invest in our people. We don't really care about change. That's fine. If you don't care about change and you just want to invest in your people, then fine.
Okay. All right. And again, as Tom mentioned, more information available on this, certainly by getting in contact with us. And at the end, we'll tell you exactly how to do that. Anything else with regard to start at the top, that first and principal most important piece, or best practice that we've seen?
No, I just would reiterate the assess and align piece.
Okay.
I think that's where, because sometimes it's hard to get people to set the time aside to do that, and you that's where you have to fight for it. And I think sometimes people can be a little intimidated by the person that runs the organization. Sure. But again, I think the messaging of either they're going to drive it or derail it is a good way to position that. Really? Of course, say it really nicely.
Exactly.
Say it very nicely.
You have to.
Yeah,
you have to.
Nicely.
These people are very important people. All right, let's move to the second one. And to do that, before we get into the content, I want to just do a quick poll. So if you are watching at home there, you can see a poll question come up here. Let's see. Hopefully you see that. And there's, how many different sales roles do you think exist? And those are pretty self-explanatory. So just fill that in, and then we'll kind of get started. Okay. Pretty quick. Yeah, we're in pretty good shape. So Tom, the results kind of show 4 people believe there are 2 to 5 different roles.
Okay.
1 person believes there are 6 to 10 different roles. Mm-hmm. And 2 people believe that there are more than 10 roles. So that's interesting. Why don't we I
think that's my mother.
she dialed in, did she?
We got her to dial in. She knows the answer to the question.
She does. She does. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about multiple roles. the different situations that people get involved in. How many roles are there actually?
There actually, and we're not going to dive into the details of this, but there are actually 11 roles.
11 roles.
When you think about, if you think about the major categories, there's hunters, the people that basically primarily acquire reps, acquire accounts, opportunities. There's farmers, the account managers. Then you've got more transactional reps, whether it's customer service that sell or inbound reps or outbound reps. Those are the big categories. Then you have inside sales versus field. You have reps that are selling to SMB versus enterprise. When you look at all those factors, environment, size, role, it actually is 11 roles.
Yeah.
Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters if you have multiple roles in your organization, because each organization sees themselves as unique. If you have inside sales reps that are calling on SMB outbound and you have account managers or field, there is some differences. And the way I always like to say it, if your training is 90% relevant, then they're going to focus on the 10%.
Of course.
So
of course they will.
So the key is that you have to get, or the other reason it might matter is you may have the same role, but they sell different solutions. We worked with a company a couple of years ago, and they had 5 different divisions, all same role, but they all saw themselves differently.
Right.
And so the company made a mistake of saying, we're going to roll out the same training.
Yeah.
Even though we had one selling medical and one selling industrial stuff, and they all were account managers, field-based, selling to large enterprise account. And yes, competency-wise, there was some similarities and almost identical in the need, but the details matter.
Yeah.
And so if you need to look at each unique sales organization and do the same thing you did with what we talked about earlier, is do the assessment and alignment.
Okay.
You need to treat them uniquely, because they won't feel represented. And if they have power, and if they don't buy in, they will sabotage this. So you need to stop, instead of just rolling out the training, is treat them differently, have them come up with their own reinforcement and sustainment plan, have them buy into what's going to happen either in the classroom as well as in the sustainment section of your process. So that's I think that's something that needs to be said. This is a mistake. Why is it number 2? We see this all the time.
Right.
There's no, I like to back to the football analogy. There's just no such thing as football training.
Yeah.
Right. There's 11 roles in football.
Yeah.
Now, you may hate sports, you may hate sports analogies, but it's a good, it's relevant because it's so true. You don't train a quarterback the same as you would a wide receiver or a halfback. They're just all different. So when you don't roll out sports training or football training, or soccer training, they're all different. So when you don't recognize that, they're not going to buy in.
Well, and you're right about the 10% that you don't customize or you don't make unique to them, because they will pick that out and say, this is completely irrelevant to me, even though it's 90% relevant, right?
Yeah.
So good.
And that's, one of the companies we talked about, Cox, we mentioned them, that did such a great job. They had an inside sales organization. They had a field sales organization that was focused on small, medium businesses. And then they had a enterprise. And so we had 3 different programs.
Yeah.
So we treated each organization unique. And so when we talk about some of the things that we'll unpack here later in the webinar, we can again connect to what are those things that you change when you're working with unique organizations. And
you can't argue with the results they had, given what you said earlier.
It's a great organization.
Extremely good results, right? So excellent. All right, let's keep moving to number 3, which is, drum roll, please. So this one, Tom, is interesting, because we're talking about competency, right? And I love this concept of creating the empty boxes of things that you're going to fill in sort of together collaboratively with the reps. But why don't you take us through this 3rd best practice?
So create empty boxes. I finally landed on this several years ago when I kept assessing an organization's existing training program, and I was trying to articulate why it wasn't working. And we actually just went through this process with one of our clients, and they wanted us to look at what they're currently training and why the reps weren't changing and why transformation wasn't occurring. We weren't training the reps. We were working with just the leadership team. And so that was our focus. And as we looked at their content, it was good content. But what had happened is everything was very conceptual. What we found is very effective is when you think about the competency that you want you want to train, the first thing you need to do is create an empty box. What do you want the rep to do? What information do you want them to put in that box?
Right.
And then you can back up, and everything is now to teach them how to do that or why they need to do that. But it all leads to an empty box. Like, for example, we talk about positioning a meeting. These are the areas that you want to consider. You assess your position the meeting. If I'm going to have a resource for a rep and I want to teach them how to position a meeting, I'm going to create a cheat sheet, a resource that says, I'm going to set up a meeting. The first box they need to fill in is what problem that's on the decision maker's whiteboard that I'm going to lead with.
Yeah.
So you can teach prospecting for 4 hours if you want, but it all boils down to, can you lead with what's on the decision maker's whiteboard? And
when you say whiteboard, you mean, what do you describe that for?
Whiteboard.
Folks?
So everybody you want to meet with has a whiteboard, whether metaphorically or actually it's hanging in their office. Most people have one hanging in their office.
Yeah.
Some are prettier than others.
Yes.
Some have got those cool like glass ones, where you can write on the markers, but you can't tell what it is until you write on it. That's really cool. The other day I saw one with a wall. It was a whiteboard. It was a wall.
Yeah.
So what's on their whiteboard? What that's on their whiteboard is what a prospect cares about, or what a customer cares about. Yeah. And if you can't connect the reason for your meeting with something that's on their whiteboard, they're not going to meet.
And how many things would they have on their whiteboard? It's not hundreds usually, right?
No, it's like people are working on a handful of initiatives.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, they're working on a handful of initiatives. And so prospecting or getting a meeting is about alignment. It's not about sales. It's about saying something they know they need. It's what activates what we call the RAS, the part of the brain that decides what messages are going to get through. We get 10,000 messages a day, right? And so our brain has to sift through those messages and filter and says, okay, I'm going to pay attention to that one. I'm going to ignore the other 9,999.
That's right.
Well, what our brain pays attention to is something we know we need.
Yeah.
And so if you send a message that says, hey, are you working on this? Or is this a problem? Is this something you care about? They will read it. Another way I always say this is if you hold up a picture of somebody, of them, they'll look at it.
That's
if you hold a picture of somebody, they're going to look at it. So you will always get their attention. So back to the boxes. So if I'm going to teach somebody how to write an email, if I'm going to teach somebody how to position themselves in an introduction, the first box they need to fill in before the meeting is, what problem that's on the decision maker's whiteboard do you want to lead with?
I love that. I mean, no matter whether it's a live conversation, an email, the first step forward is something that's important to them.
Something important. That's just one example.
One example.
Yeah.
Okay. So any other, I mean, you've got some other examples on here, or other, things that you can assess, but what other, tips can people use after they get their attention in that one box? What are some other boxes that coaches should be considering?
I've met you can, I'm sure the people on the webinar can read these, but like discovery roadmap.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, I've been doing this over 20 years. The first thing I do when we step into an organization and go through our assessment process is we go, what's your discovery roadmap? In other words, when I'm leading a discovery session with a customer prospect, what's the framework that I use that drives that meeting? Very few times have I seen an actual roadmap.
Right.
So there needs to be a roadmap with me at all times if I'm in sales and there's empty boxes related to the categories that are important. What does the customer want to do? We call that their point of view.
Mm-hmm.
What are pitfalls in their plan? What should they do? What are their priorities? Where does this fit with if they have a problem, where does this fit in their what are their preferences? How are they going to make decisions? So I think most people can come up with their discovery roadmap, but they haven't.
Okay.
So if I don't have one, I can't drive that as a frontline leader. So two things happen when you create these empty boxes. One, the seller is very aware of their gap. So if you're going to define successful discovery as filling in that roadmap, if you're successful at discovery, if you've captured all this information, then I, as a rep, know that.
Yes. Yep.
Right. If it's just discovery and it's concepts and bullets in a training program, I'm going, I get that. I get it. But there's no clear line that tells me either did or didn't accomplish, what I needed to accomplish in discovery. So the other thing is the manager, if I'm going to help develop the rep, I now have a tool to coach on discovery. Just like, look, the goal of discovery, we're not going to talk about listening and questioning. I mean, those are important, but we're not going to start with that. We're going to start with, did those boxes get filled in? Hey, I couldn't get the meeting. Yeah. Like I met with a rep the other day. Well, I can't get a meeting with so-and-so. I go, what would you lead with?
Yeah.
Well, I led with, hey, I know you spend this much money with us and I'd love to meet with you.
Yeah.
I'm your account representative.
Yeah.
Well, that empty box would be like, okay, meet with me because you don't know me.
Yeah.
So
probably not on their whiteboard.
That's not on their whiteboard.
Meet with all my vendors.
That becomes a nebulous conceptual conversation.
Yes.
So it needs to be concrete. So start with the boxes.
Okay. Now, and obviously, we're talking about sustainment throughout this as a best practice, but when we fill in these boxes, that really does start to drive our ability to do this in a sustained fashion, if you will.
Yeah, it helps it helps the rep.
Yeah.
Because it also helps the manager. If a manager wants to coach a rep, the first thing he's going to say is, well, show me your roadmap.
Yeah. We have mutual accountability because we know what we talked about the last time. And
so if I'm motivated as a seller and I want to get better, you just gave me a tool that helps me coach myself. If I've got a rep who's struggling and doesn't get it, and I'm a frontline manager, and maybe they just forgot, or maybe they just are confused, I can go to that and I can now leverage that to drive sustainment. It also can go in your CRM.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of ways. I'm not saying that it needs to all be paper. I do think they need some resources they can take with them. How do I prep for a meeting? But it also can live in your CRM.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Good. So that's creating the empty boxes. Let's keep moving and move on to, what exactly do you mean measure in 4D?
So this is, number 4.
Yeah, number 4.
Well, measure is key, right? Because if you can't measure it, one, the rep may not care. I mean, I remember a rep telling me the other day, because I go to training all the time, and I'm not really engaged. I go, why? Because they're not going to do anything afterwards.
The God's honest truth.
Yeah, it's like I don't know. It's going to flavor the month.
Yeah,
like it's not,
been through these before.
So and people are goal oriented. They want to know how they're doing, and so if you give them a system, and again, I go back to sports. If I play golf, I know how I'm doing. I know if I can drive the ball well because it lands in the fairway, X percentage. I know my score. I know how I chip. I know how all of it's very measurable. In sales, we've made it too nebulous. So we need to be able to measure it. So I, as a performer, know how I'm doing and what levers I can affect that will ultimately give me results. But also as an organization, I'm not going to back something I can't measure. If you can't walk into a senior leader's, office and say, here's how we are measuring it and here's how we're driving results, then they're going to back it.
Yeah.
If they say, well, how'd training go? You go, great. Well, and everybody in learning knows that they need to measure it. So the question is what? And so what we think is there's 4 dimensions to what you should measure. And most organizations only measure 2 of these. So I think it's important. Let's
unpack those. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think most organizations for sure measure what we would just consider results, whatever those results are. That could be revenue, right? That could be percentage of quota. Those things are, dare I say, easy to measure. But there are probably 3 other dimensions less easy. The second easiest one is probably activity, right?
Yeah.
But activity versus productivity, I mean, isn't there a difference?
Yeah. So if you think about it, is the center of your dashboard is results, like you said. So we all want to drive results.
Most important, for sure.
So but what drives results?
Yeah.
Right. What are the other levers, dials that drive results? And so one of them is productivity.
Yeah.
Right. So that's, what actions are required to achieve the highest level of results? What do they reps need to do?
Yeah.
So I need to do something. What's your metrics? What are your process? What are the things that I need to do? The other dial though is desire. Do I want to change? Because if the rep doesn't want to change, then it doesn't matter, right? Nothing matters. You can't get them to work harder, and they're certainly not going to learn a new set of competencies. So if I need to measure desire, because if they don't have the desire, I need to address that. That's my focus, not productivity.
Yeah.
So in productivity, as you said, it's important to measure the right things, and that's a whole nother webinar in and of itself.
Probably.
I think the key thing is you want to measure metrics that matter.
Yeah.
Like what actually moves the needle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I think one of the companies I worked with measured one thing: first meetings with prospects.
That was the most important thing.
Or just first meetings if they're account managers, first meetings. So they measured that because you're moving the needle
Yeah.
You're developing your pipeline if you're meeting with new people.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the key metrics.
I mean, a lot of companies we talk to measure number of calls, which is interesting, but that's really an activity because you can't get at the quality of that call.
Yeah.
If you measure new meetings gotten, it could be 100 calls to get to a new meeting,
right.
But now at least you know how those metrics work together, right?
And there's nothing wrong with measuring those activities, but what you don't want is, because we got so much information that we're sifting through every day, is you want people to look at the things that matter. And if they can look at all of it, great, look at all of it.
Yeah.
Right. Because number of meetings, number of calls will ultimately determine meetings. And you can see this, but ultimately, if I've only got a limited window of what I'm going to focus on, I'm going to focus on those metrics that really make a difference. Like our big one in our organization, again, is a discovery meeting or an assessment or a presentation. Those things are what really drive.
And an old sales leader I worked with had the best line. I still use it all the time. People respect what you inspect.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what you're looking at, the reps are going to be responsive to, because you're going to have this joint accountability, right? So, and there's one left that we haven't covered, right?
Yeah. So the last dial is competency. So the competency is all about the ability. So productivity is about what you do, right? Competency is about how well you do it. What's those set of abilities that determine my level of execution? So we want to measure that as well. And this is why we call it measuring in 4 dimensions. Most just focus on results and productivity because they think they can only measure that. But we really need to measure, if we're going to drive change, we need to measure desire, productivity, competency, and results.
Good. And, I think we've got a couple seconds here, and I'd love to do a quick poll. This is going to be 4 quick polls. It's yes or no answers. And I'm going to ask you these to just fill these in very quickly. As a leader today, do you measure results? So take this one, take a second and respond to that. And then I'll close that and move to the next. We got all 3 that measure results that have responded. So let's close that poll. And let's open the second one, which is, do you measure desire in any way? Be curious. Not many measure desire, Tom. One does, though. Be curious to catch up with that individual.
It's my mother.
She's back again.
She's back.
Next is very simply, do you measure productivity metrics? Some examples there for you. Discovery meetings, sales calls. And 3 people do measure productivity. Okay, great. And finally, the last one, do you measure competency? Different behaviors, competencies. So people are doing that in some numbers as well. Excellent. All right. So Tom, this last slide that sort of summarizes what we just talked about, the 4 dimensions that you were talking about, the results, the desire, the productivity, and the competency. Mm-hmm. Why is all of this so important? Why is it so important to measure in 4 dimensions versus what most people probably do today, which is results and maybe some activity?
Yeah, well, it because it really tells you, some of these are lagging indicators and some of these are leading indicators. I mean, I think the best way to measure the impact of training is competency.
Yeah. If
you can tie competency to results, then you can control competency. You can control the development of that. And that if I develop competencies, I'm going to hit results. And actually competencies are much easier to measure. And we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
The other reason I think it's so important is you don't know what to work on.
Yeah.
If I'm working on productivity and I got a desire problem, you're wasting your time.
Yeah.
If I'm coaching you and I'm trying to help you develop competency, but I don't want to change, you're wasting your time.
Right.
So you focus here where the gap is. And really, you should really work left to right. Work on desire. Got the desire. You've got the rep motivated. And again, that's a whole nother conversation for another day about how you address the 4 barriers to change and what drives desire. But you've got to ignite the desire. Then you move to productivity because that's the easiest thing to affect. And then you work on competency. And so we talk about leaders wearing these 3 hats. They lead to drive desire. They manage to focus on productivity or drive productivity, and they coach to develop competency. So That's how you. But I think that's the key to being able to measure this, which I know that's where you're going, is really the front line.
It really is.
So the reason most people don't measure this is because they don't know how to do it, and the key is the frontline leader.
Yep. So we are running a smidge long, Tom. So I'm going to push us to the final of the 5 best practices to crush your training ROI, and then we'll leave ourselves a little bit of time for Q&A, if that's all right. So let's move to certify your leaders. Now, what does that mean?
Certify your leaders. Yeah. So that's this is, even though it's number 5, you might even say this is number 1 as far as the impact that it has. So we've set up what you need to measure. Well, really, you need to certify your leaders to pull this off, because the only way you're going to measure desire is going to be through your frontline leaders. And so, and I'll just give you a quick, talk about that quickly, is that the only way you're going to measure desire, there's only one thing that determines somebody's desire, is they're willing to work on the developmental activity assigned by the leader.
Yeah.
So if I'm watching you, observing you, and we see a gap and we agree there's a gap, and I say, well, let's work on that. So let's say you've got a gap in discovery and you don't have a discovery roadmap. And my developmental activity is, why don't you develop your roadmap, improve it, develop it, customize it, whatever. And then we're going to meet on Friday and we're going to role play. And so then you go meet on Friday and say, well, did you develop your roadmap? And the answer is no. You got a desire problem.
Yep.
So desire is not about attitude or how pleasant they are or how much they challenge your recommendation. It's really boils down to one thing simple. Are they willing to invest the time to work on it?
Yeah.
So that's what needs to happen. The frontline leaders are the ones that really ultimately drive desire and the ability to measure desire. Same thing with competency. So what we think is change happens one-to-one. And so the way that you ultimately are going to drive change is you've got to certify your frontline leaders. And the reason we use the word certification is because you really need to create a situation where they can demonstrate that they have the ability to drive desire, productivity, and competency, and they're following the process.
Yep. You get that consistency across, right? I mean, so I'm not doing things completely different from how you're doing things, and so on and so forth, right? So, so let's talk about just some memorable keys to this certification process.
Let's talk about how you. So, so sometimes companies will hire us to certify their managers. So let's just assume that can't happen. Then you need to have people in the organization who are master coaches.
Yeah.
And so they work with your frontline leaders.
Yep.
So if you've got a handful of, depending on how many you need, 1, 3, 4, 5, whatever you need. Sure. Case of working with Aflac, they had 60. And so you need to create people who really understand how to lead, manage, and coach and drive desire, productivity, and competency. And so they can become the ones who will then work with your leaders. Well, so what do they focus on? They really focus on teaching, making sure they know how to lead, they know how to manage, and they know how to coach, and that there's a consistency. So if they're doing it over time, so they're not just doing it once and go, I can do it. I can demonstrate that I can do it. So how do you do that? You watch them.
Yeah.
And so the way that our process is we meet with the manager, we coach for them. So they watch us coach, and we review all the key competencies that we've taught them. We review how to assess and how to diagnose and all the things that we teach them or you want to teach them.
Right.
And then second cycle is that we co-coach and review the same thing. Third cycle, they coach. And so after 3 cycles, which we like to see happens over 3 months, at the end of that, we're going to know, okay, they're following the process and they have the ability to lead, manage, and coach. And so the key thing about that time frame is if you can get them to do it, right, and you can create accountability to do it at least for 3 months, they're going to see traction. They're going to get momentum. It's kind of like
the habit.
Yeah, I did a what's it called? A Whole 30 diet a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And it's designed like you don't have to eat this way forever. You just have to eat this way for 30 days. So you had to cut out dairy and alcohol. Not that I ever drank anything, Scott.
No, of course not.
No, it's no mom.
Caffeine either? I mean,
you can have caffeine. Thank you.
You
but,
could.
Yeah, all that. But it's basically just a healthy diet. Well, they had a design where if you did this for 30 days, at the end of 30 days, it was going to change you. So it was the minimum amount of time that you would see some momentum and you see change. It's the same thing for these 3 cycles. If you can get a manager to shift from just having management meetings to learning how to lead and coach and follow your process, then they're going to see traction, and then they're going to be convert. They'll convert.
Yeah, and I know, this is not about software, but there is a software program available from Aslan that allows you to sort of keep that all in one place. We call it the Catalyst dashboard. And so if you're interested in how some companies have been able to manage and keep all this data straight in a piece of software, we've got that, and be happy to share it with you if you want to reach out. So, Tom, anything else on certifying leaders before we kind of move into our wrap up?
No, I would just say, reiterate, I guess, a point that we made somewhere in here, is that change happens one-to-one. If you can only do one thing, focus on your leaders.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So if you're going to roll out a huge training initiative, or you've got a rep problem, or you're not hitting your number, focus on your leaders. It's 1/10 of the cost. You'll see 50% improvement.
Yeah.
And we've seen it in as little as 6 months.
Yeah.
So it's the least expensive thing you can do, and it's what will have the most impact.
Well, it has been great having you here to talk about these 5 secrets to, better training results, to get the ROI for such a big investment. And so if you guys have gotten some good value out of this, start adding questions to the Q&A section. My email is on the screen right now. If you need any additional information, we can send the slides out to the group that's been able to participate here today. And of course, we're recording this. So if you wanted to go back and listen to any part that might be interesting, that will be made available to you as well. And with that concludes the formal part of the webinar. We are open to any questions. I don't think we were ever able to get, Tom, I can't get the mics on for our guests, so they'll have to come in via Q&A or chat. So let me check the chat window and see if we have any questions. I don't see any in the chat window. And Q&A, if you have any questions, I'll give it another 30 seconds. You can pipe those in. Other than that, Tom, thanks very much for putting this all together and being a guest here on our webinar. And hopefully we'll see you again on another episode of Ales with Aslan.
Yes, we'll definitely. And Ales with Aslan, we can actually
have an ale.
Which is webinar. We're very focused.
It's very formal.
Very formal and focused on webinar.
Yeah. No questions coming in, Tom. No chats coming in. A couple folks saying they enjoyed the session. Good insights. Very well done. Great session. So that's exciting to hear. I'm glad you guys got something out of it. Certainly reach out to us. Again, my name is Scott Cassidy. I'm your host, and my email is on the screen, scassidy@aslantraining.com, if we can be of any further assistance. Thanks very much for having us, and we'll talk to you soon.